believe our nation has gone astray from what I call the biblical basis of the Bill of Rights. And you can parallel the Bill of Rights with the Ten Commandments. You know, the Bible says that when the righteous rule, the people rejoice. And when the wicked rule, the people groan. And there's been a lot of groaning throughout the United States of America. I don't think we want this crew who are violating our Constitution rewriting anything, because all they'll do is codify their violations. So I want to be brief with my comments. So I want to introduce to you our leader for today, the person who's organized this event, Mr. Hal Shurtleff from the John Birch Society. Hal.
Thank you, Earl. That was very brief. Walls. All right, well, we're here today after the press conference. What we're going to be doing is distributing information to legislators on this subject. We're going to be sending this reprint, Levin's Risky Proposal, from the New American Magazine that came out last fall, I believe. And we have CDs and DVDs of legislators speaking about it from Oklahoma that we'll be making available. In fact, Oklahoma just recently shot down their more recent call for an Article 5 convention. So first off, let me get to what an Article 5 convention is, because a lot of people are sort of confused about that. And in the U.S. Constitution, there are, in our Article 5 of that Constitution, there are two ways to amend the U.S. Constitution. The first way was the only way that's ever been used under our Constitution, where 2/3 of the House and Senate, the U.S. House and Senate, will propose amendments, and then they go to the states for ratification. And there's two ways to do it. It's either by the state legislatures, which is how it's usually done, and generally there's a sunset clause, usually a 7-year period, a 5-year period. The other way is for 2/3 of the states, and this would be state legislators. The governors aren't involved in it, so it's not like a regular bill. And the legislators of both houses, in case, when they do, I think there's one that doesn't, one is unicameral, they will pass resolutions, they transmit that to Congress, and with this 3/4, in this case 34, I'm sorry, 2/3. And then they have a convention. Now, we've never had a convention in our nation under our Constitution. We had one convention under the Articles of Confederation, and we know what happened there. We know that the delegates were there as a sovereign entity, even though the Articles of Confederation said when you put amendments and you add amendments, you have to have all 13 states at the time, majority of states. And the delegates decided not to deal with amendments, but to rewrite the Constitution. And some people refer to that as a runaway. Now, we're very glad they did what they did. But the bottom line is that they were a sovereign body. They had the right to do that, you see. Now, a little history of the Article 5. Since our Constitution was adopted, there's been over 700 applications for a convention. For the first 100 years, every application was simply an application for an Article 5 convention without any stated purpose. And the first one was in 1789. There are actually two of them. Rhode Island became the 13th state after struggling a bit about adopting the Constitution. And they immediately had a call for CONCON, a Article 5 convention. It wasn't until the 1890s there was a populist movement afoot, and they were advocating the direct election of senators. They were saying that the office of the Senate was corrupt because before that, legislators of the states would appoint the senators. And they were, in essence, ambassadors from the states. So the applications back then called for a single-purpose convention, which the Constitution doesn't acknowledge. The Constitution just says states will call a convention to propose amendments. So you may get to this convention thinking it's one issue, and that your issue may not even be brought up, you see. So we were actually 2 states away at that point when Congress decided to pass the amendment, and it was ratified by 3/4 of the states. It became the 17th Amendment. What was interesting is that one of the arguments against or in favor of an Article 5 is that states would never do anything crazy or unreasonable. Well, what happened there is that states gave a vast portion of their power to the federal government. They relinquished that. So states can do a lot of crazy things without a convention, by the way. We live here in New York City. I think New York, you can affirm that. Then there were numerous calls for various reasons, but there was a Supreme Court decision dealing with how states, the state districts, the senatorial and the representative districts, that really was abridgment upon this right to states to determine their own policies. So there was a movement to get an amendment to sort of overturn that, and we actually won state away. But for some reason, the movement died down, and it wasn't until the mid to late 70s there was a call for a balanced budget amendment. We refer to it as a BBA. Now, most people who are fiscal conservatives would say, well, what's wrong with a balanced budget amendment? And at first view, it sounds really good. But if you read some of these proposed amendments, they never tell you that they can still have an unbalanced budget. The one that Mark Levin proposes in his book does let the states determine if there's an override. I think he wants 2/3 of the states. Those states some states are rolling in session once every 2 years, or they're out of session by April or May. So it'll be kind of difficult. But it'll also be a total transformation of how our system is set up. Also, a balanced budget will not give us a constitutional budget. It will not cut the excesses, the spending and all of the excesses at the federal and state level. So, and I tell people, hey, Congress always has a balanced budget. They just borrow the money. So the books are balanced. We just borrow millions or trillions of dollars, and everything's fine. We would, again, 2 states away from that balanced budget amendment. I think the fact that Reagan got elected took the wind out of some of the sails. As, oh, we're saved. We got a Republican in office. And so the high mark was about 1985 and 86. Alabama became, I think, the 32nd state. But then the Burgess Society got very much involved in this issue. And we were able to get a number of states to rescind their call for a balanced budget amendment. And we were we didn't hear a lot of action on this until about 1995, when there was something called a Conference of the States. It was led by Governor Leavitt of Utah at the time. And this was a little extra constitutional, sort of a round backdoor way to get a convention. The notion that the states are sovereign, which is true, that they can have their own convention without an Article 5. And our members around the country derailed this within about 4 months, simply by informing people. And this is an issue that's not a left and right issue. You get people on both the left and the right opposed to this and in favor of it. So, again, some issues are kind of clear-cut, left and right. This is not. So we decided that there was all these live calls that go back, to the beginning of our republic. And we had a campaign to get all of the calls off the books. I know Bob back here was involved in that. And boy, was it tough. Because most people, it was either over their head, it wasn't that exciting an issue, it didn't put campaign dollars in the coffers of politicians. So most politicians didn't even want to deal with it. But after a lot of hard work, we got about 14 states to rescind all of the calls. The last one, I think, was in New Hampshire, where we spent 20 years, every 2 years, we'd submit the same resolution, and they finally acted on it. It was interesting. We had sort of like Liberty Republican types sponsor the bill, or the resolution, but it passed in the Democrat-controlled House and Senate by almost overwhelming margin. So sometimes, in this case, the Democrats did what was right. 2 years later, however, another resolution was introduced, and we fought it, and some backdoor maneuverings happened, and they actually got another live call for a balanced budget amendment, Article 5 convention. But something very interesting happened in September of 2011, and it was one of our good members in this area that kind of tipped me off about it. There was a convention on the Constitutional Convention, con. If you want to go to their website to see exactly what happened there, it's con.org. Professor Larry Lessig, Harvard University Law School, a man who's sort of a key player in this movement, he was able to get a man named Mark Meckler at that time he was head of the National Tea Party Patriots. He has since resigned and formed this group called the Convention of the States that's working for the sole purpose of getting an Article 5 convention. But it wasn't just Larry and Mark. There were some interesting individuals there. And I tried to become a member of the panel. And they were told at this convention, at this conference, both sides would be, there's only 2 sides, Somebody asked me the other day, one of the COS guys in Maine, said, is there a middle ground? I said, no. Once an airplane takes off, the passengers can't get off until it lands, right? So there's no middle ground here. You either have one, you don't have one. But Mark Meckler and Larry Lessig, along with groups called like the Coffee Party, the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian type group, the Goldwater Institute, named after the late Barry Goldwater, who, by the way, was against an Article 5 convention. you see. Then you had a man from, I have trouble pronouncing his name, I think it's Cenk Uygur of Young Turks. He was one of the attendees. He formed the left-wing branch of the Article 5, something called Wolfpack, which is a George Soros-backed entity. And this is the resolution that was introduced here in New York, is the sort of the Wolfpack version of it. So, so 2011 to 2013, there's been a big drive for this Article 5. And right now, we're like between 20 and 24 states have got live applications. This is the situation, though. There are some that believe that the resolution has to all be identical. So it either has to be for a balanced budget. I just read a report that came out of the Congressional Research Services in 2012. And they said Congress doesn't seem to acknowledge any callers over 7 years of age. So if you ask friends of the Article 5 Convention, they'll say that we have more than enough, and we've had more than enough for quite a while. But would a call from 1790 be valid, or would a call from Vermont asking to outlaw bigamy and polygamy in 1904, so would that be considered valid? So that's why our goal is not just to stop any new ones, but to rescind the old ones. And when these folks, the Conference of the States people, I think the major premise is that new amendments, would somehow reverse 100 years of government usurpation, federal usurpation. And they tell us that this is the only remedy that we have left. Well, that's not true. When I testified at the hearings in New Hampshire, I said, we have a better remedy. They're called elections. You see? And they like that. The Democrats and Republicans on the committee, they like that. And if we have, and I do agree, and the Birch Society pretty much agrees with the sentiments of folks in the Convention of States, that we do have an out-of-control federal government at congressional level, at the Congress, the Supreme Court, and the President. I said, so these are the same folks that are going to enforce these new amendments? And the argument is that we're going to write these amendments in a way that cannot be misconstrued. Well, let me think. What is the part of the Second Amendment? Shall not be infringed. How can that be misconstrued? Have they been infringing that right all over the country? And in Congress, you better believe it. So if we can't define what is, they're going to have a lot of trouble defining a new amendment, written in a new amendment. And remember, some laws that have been passed, like the RICO statute, that was supposed to be against organized crime. Now who, unless you're an organized criminal, why would you be against something like that? They've been used, that bill or that law has been used against pro-lifers. So sometimes it can be used against you. Now Mike Farris, who was one of the key members of the Convention of the States, Homeschool Legal Defense Association founder, he wants to have an amendment to acknowledge parental rights. And it sounds, well, who would be against that? You're a parent, of course you have rights. Well, the Constitution doesn't mention that right because you have it. It doesn't need to mention it. But now that Congress has, now there's an amendment, who will have control over those rights? The federal government. Is that what they really want? You see? And they believe that every time the Supreme Court makes a bad decision, we have to have an amendment to rectify that bad decision, instead of overturning the decision. And also the Supreme Court can be reined in under Article 3. You can impeach them, which is a very rare thing, I admit. Congress can also limit their appellate jurisdiction without having to have an Article 5. You see? And that's been done on a regular basis. There's also something called nullification. Now that's sort of a dirty word in some circles, but it's the 10th Amendment. And we've seen a recent example of that, the Real ID Act. I think there were over 26 or 24 states that would not comply. And guess what happens when the federal government gets that many states? They just say, okay, we'll give you a couple more years, and it's on the back burner. That has not been enforced. Some states have adopted it, but many states have not. And New Hampshire was one of the states that started the movement. I don't even if they use the term nullify. I know some of the nullification opponents refer to that as you must be a neo-Confederate if you're opposed to nullification. Well, thanks to Tom Woods, Professor Tom Woods, who's done a lot of research on that, he said they use nullification to nullify the fugitive slave laws. So that's something that they need to look into. And also, we're told that these states are demanding a restoration of their balance of power. What states are those? How many states are actually demanding a restoration of the balance of power? They take federal money, right? As long as they're taking that federal money, they're going to be under federal control. So stop taking the money, you see? And if I understand that most states rely on about 35% of their budget, coming from the federal government. That doesn't include federal mandates. I won't get into that. We're told that 3/4 of the states won't do anything unreasonable. And both groups, the Wolfpack people use that term unreasonable when they testify, and the Convention of the States people. I would say to you that what's reasonable to someone like me is unreasonable to somebody who belongs to Wolfpack. I think it's reasonable to repeal the 16th Amendment and maybe do away with compulsory education laws, but I bet you somebody who's a progressive doesn't believe that. They think it's terribly unreasonable. I'm certain, right? These folks on the Wolfpack, the left-wing side of the Article 5, their big cause is to have an amendment that will end the concept of corporate personhood. And they're going after Citizens United, and most of these resolutions make reference to that Supreme Court decision. And what's sort of interesting, Citizens United gives an award to Mark Levin. I don't know, do they realize that Mark Levin's working, indirectly maybe, with groups that want to put him out of business? And also the National Governors Association is endorsed in Article 5, and they hold in part the copyright to Common Core, and here's Mike Farris fighting against Common Core, but also working with one arm of the group for Article 5. So it's very interesting how these things work out. So what we're doing here in New York is we're urging the Senate to say no to S6559, which is the calling for a Constitutional Convention. In fact, they use the term Constitutional Convention. See, we're told that that's not what it is. It's an Article 5, which means the same thing. And it doesn't matter. They quote George Washington. It's all nice, very nice, well worded. They quote George Washington here, and they want to have this this amendment to outlaw corporate personhood. But this can be construed as a live call if it's passed, and it's been assigned to the Judiciary Committee. So we're hoping that we can get this resolution either tabled, or if it comes up for a vote in committee, that they vote no on it. We have a Facebook page called Choose Freedom, Stop Con, and there's a lot of references and resources there updated. In fact, I got the 1979 report, the Senate report, 1,300 pages, full of testimony from law scholars on both sides of the spectrum, and a lot of their writings. The average person doesn't read much in the magazines about Article 5, but law professors and law students do. So there's countless articles going back to the 40s and 50s. So a lot has been said about this, and almost all of the folks that testified at this hearing in 1979, the Senate hearing, said they used the term runaway, they used the term bolt the door, latch the door, you don't want to have this, and some pretty prominent individual law scholars. So I make that available on cyberspace as well. And so with that, we want to thank you. If there are any questions?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
What do you say to people who say that you can craft a state legislature can craft a law forcing the delegate to vote the way they want?
That's a good question, because I have a friend of mine, Dan Itza in New Hampshire, who supports this. And he actually tried to get a bill passed in New Hampshire to have some type of criminal behavior, 6 months in prison or whatever it was. And my answer is that, well, you're committing the crime outside of the jurisdiction of the state, so that's going to be hard to enforce. The second part of that is, if I want to see a new constitution, I'm willing to take the consequences of a year in jail or 6 months or whatever, which can be overturned pretty easily. When they do that, the states may do that, but I would say the delegates could easily ignore that and be willing to suffer the consequences. I would even suggest that could be overturned in a higher court.
Who would be the delegates to such a convention?
Right, exactly.
What kinds of people would be the delegates to a Mark Levin convention? Who would they be? Who would the New York State Legislature pick?
Well, since there are no laws that govern it, we don't really know, but we can assume, based upon the political makeup of the various states, who the delegates will be from New York. It won't be Earl Wallace and anyone in this room, I guarantee you.
Yes.
New England is the same way. You have a Republican governor in Maine, but you have a left-wing House and Senate, so it's not likely that you're going to have any delegates promoting liberty there. California, where Mark Meckler is from, they're not going to. Mark Meckler won't be at that convention. And the notion that 26 Republicans, there's 26 states with Republican majorities. Somehow we can rest assured Well, what kind of Republicans are they? Guys like John McCain? I wouldn't trust, John McCain Republicans any more than I would trust a Nancy Pelosi Democrat.
Do you think the founders blew it by including Article 5 in the Constitution?
That's a good question. I don't think they blew it, but I think the climate was a whole lot different. Although James Madison, a year later, after the convention, he said that he would shudder at the thought of another one. So that's a good question.
Do you think it was a flaw in the Constitution?
I don't think it was a flaw at the time. I think our founders expected people to be a lot more vigilant.
And now, once you start saying that something in the Constitution was a flaw at the time, doesn't that open the question to the idea of what other flaws there might be in the original document?
That's a legitimate question, but I think the Constitution isn't flawed. I think it's the people that are administering the Constitution are flawed. That's really the issue here.
Thank you.